Hello, world history students. This is Mrs. Politsky, and I have your notes for Chapter 27, Section 4, The Interwar Years, Dictators in Europe. And to kind of start off a little bit, the big thing to remember is that the interwar years are the years that are basically in between the end of World War One and the beginning of World War Two. And this is kind of the time when there's a lot of political instability in Europe as a result of the end of World War One. Uh, Along with that, there's a lot of economic instability, and these things together make it ripe for dictators to come to power. So I want to kind of focus on the four main dictatorial powers that are going to take place or happen during the 1930s. The most famous is probably that of Germany. Adolf Hitler comes to power. He actually becomes chancellor in roughly 1933, about the same time that Franklin Roosevelt becomes president of the United States. But really, Hitler's rise within the Nazi Party kind of goes before that. Shortly after the end of World War One, Hitler kind of is kind of down on his luck. He finds his organization that is known as the National Democratic Socialist, and for the most part, this becomes the Nazi Party. He is not a founding member, but he joins this organization, and he kind of makes a name for himself there. And by the 1920s, he's kind of like maybe their spokesman. That's probably the best way to explain it. Not only that, but in the 1920s, we had the rise of Joseph Stalin. After the death of Vladimir Lenin in 1924, Stalin, using some of his stiff arm techniques, eventually becomes the premier of the Soviet Union. And he literally goes after his political opponents, and even those people who were communists. Anybody who would try him for power, he certainly saw as a political enemy, and he starts purging the party, the Communist Party, of anybody who could be an enemy of his. And for the most part, he was a pretty brutal man, really no different than that of Adolf Hitler. Okay. Um, Benito Mussolini, he's actually the first of all these dictators. He actually comes to power right at the start of 1920. He is a fascist, but if you read a little bit into his past, he was a former communist. He kind of decides that he's not getting anywhere with them, and kind of does a 180 flip politically and becomes a fascist. And he kind of pushes out the Italian monarchy and takes command of Italy. He's one of the first fascists to come to power. As time is going to go by, he's not necessarily the guy that we're going to be fearful of by any means, but he's certainly a thorn in our side. Okay, the last of the fascists, the guy who's going to actually be able to lead his country the longest, is a guy named Francisco Franco. He was the dictator of Spain. And during the 1930s, there was a civil war that happened in the nation of Spain. Basically, you had the Republican Army, which kind of had some inklings with socialism and such, and a little bit with maybe perhaps the Communist Party. And then you had Francisco's power. Needless to say, with a little bit of help from guys like Mussolini and Adolf Hitler, Franco is going to win his civil war. But what's interesting is when World War II starts, Spain actually becomes a neutral nation. And as a result of that, they're not really faced with the brunt of the war. And this allows him to actually be around after the end of World War II. He actually leads Spain until his death in the mid 1970s. And after that period of time, then Spain kind of moves away from fascism and becomes more of what I would say more of a democratic state as a result of that. But certainly he was a thug in his own right. So we're going to talk a little bit about these dictators. Benito Mussolini, he ruled Italy as an all-powerful leader of a totalitarian government. Anytime that we talk about the term totalitarian, that means a government that has total control over a person's life. And that could be guys like Hitler and Mussolini, who were fascist, but it also can mean guys like Joseph Stalin, who was a communist. Any government that's going to really control every aspect of your life is a totalitarian government. Okay. Italy had invaded the nation of Ethiopia. And if you remember back to when we talked about the continent of Africa, Ethiopia was one of those countries in Africa that was never colonized by European power. And Mussolini obviously was kind of power hungry. He also wanted to make an empire for himself. And so he went after Ethiopia. Okay, he wanted to show off his military strength. He wanted to expand his territory. In the end, it's not going to turn out the way he wanted. In the Soviet Union, I mentioned before we had Joseph Stalin that's going to come to power in 1924. He uses violence and fear and propaganda. Okay, it's a tool to kind of get his agenda across. He puts together his plans for the Soviet government or the communist government known as a 5-year plan. And it's basically this plan that he's promoting to the people through his use of propaganda that's going to improve Soviet economics and improve industrial output. The only side that you need to know is that not all of that was true. There were a lot of people that were victimized as a result of this. And some of those people that were the ones facing the brunt of this victimization were the Ukrainians. In 1932, Ukrainian peasants, because of Stalin and his agenda, faced near starvation because they resisted this idea of collectivization. Stalin wanted to basically take all the farms because Ukraine was kind of like the breadbasket of Eastern Europe at that period of time. It produced a lot of wheat and such. And he basically was telling the farmers there what they could plant and what he thought their agricultural yield should be as far as, how many bushels per acre, if we were looking at it maybe in American terms. And as a result, a lot of people weren't able to meet those standards, and hence they were punished. When they were faced with, famine, Stalin refused to send food because they should be able to produce it themselves. And what ends up happening is thousands of people starve to death. If you look at these little children here, a lot of them are emaciated, meaning that they've lost so much weight. There's a little child here that their belly is bloated, and that's not because they've eaten. That's because a lot of times when people who have been living under a starvation diet for a period of time, their stomachs become bloated. And for the most part, it was a very cruel period of time. And certainly there were a lot of people in Europe that um, were not necessarily happy with what Stalin was doing. Farm owners, when we talk about ownership, in a communist state, typically the communists want to own all the property and all facets of production. So when we look at the difference between Vladimir Lenin and Joseph Stalin, Lenin wanted to give land to the peasants, whereas Stalin, being kind of a diehard communist, took this land back and put it under government control. And when the peasants resisted Stalin's move, he executed lots of them, and he sent them to these labor camps called gulags. Gulags were basically kind of a precursor of like a concentration or an extermination camp. They were brutal. And some of the worst ones were located in a region of Russia known as Siberia, which is a little bit north of the Arctic Circle. It was cold and it was awful. Okay, it was definitely a huge punishment. During the mid-30s, Stalin started what was known as the Great Terror, or sometimes AKA the Great Purge. And basically, he got rid of people who were basically rebelling against him, and even people who were within their own communist party. Anybody who would challenge his authority was, for the most part, targeted. And that led to the death of thousands of people. So in a way, Stalin was a pretty crazy guy. Um, Talking about Germany, shortly after the end of World War One, Germany's economy collapsed. And what I want to show you is a little bit of the valuation of the German mark, which is kind of like the equivalent of a German or of a U.S. dollar. And 1914, it would take 4.2 German marks to equal a US dollar. By the end of World War I, it would take 14 German marks to equal a US dollar. By 1921, 76.7 marks. Okay, and then by the time we get to November of 1923, you needed a wagon load of German marks to even equal a U.S. dollar. And what we're seeing here, as the valuation changes, is basically inflation. Your currency is worth nothing. You need a lot of it to buy just the basics. And for the most part, the economy was in a spiral. Okay, it was not necessarily doing very well, and people were grumpy about it. They were looking for something that was going to stabilize it. And you're basically making all the conditions ripe for a dictator to come to power. So after World War I, the Weimar Republic is formed in Germany. It's basically a democratic form of government that's going to rule over Germany. It's going to replace the Kaiser and his imperialistic monarchy. By the early 20s, inflation had soared and many saw their savings wiped out. And who comes to the forefront as a guy who's going to save all the Germans from all their troubles? It's an Austrian-born guy named Adolf Hitler. Hitler's not even German, but he joined the German army during World War I. You can see a picture of him here. There's a little X here above Hitler. This is him in his military uniform before he started making that strange cookie duster mustache that he's known for. And in the 1920s, he joins the National Socialist Party, aka Nazi Party. And in 1923, with all this economic instability, the Nazis tried to overthrow the Weimar Republic, the democratic government of Germany. And what ends up happening is Hitler gets jailed for this event. While he's in jail, he's basically given an opportunity to write his book. And I will say this, when he's in jail, he is not necessarily in the most strict or punishing of localities. He's kind of like under house arrest in a sense. And he writes his book known as Mein Kampf. Mein Kampf in English means my struggle. And it's basically here where he spouts off all of his weird ideas about politics and his beliefs in racial superiority. He basically writes a lot about his anti-Semitic views about the Jews and how he's going to blame the Jews for all the problems that the Germans are facing. There's really no real evidence that the Jews were really the cause of anybody's problems, but he's looking for a scapegoat, and that's who he picks on. And as a result of that, a lot of people start reading this book, and certainly he starts getting people that are interested in what he has to say. As far as coming to power in Germany, one of the things that Hitler does once he is able to take command of the political system is he's going to start rebuilding the military. And sometimes we call that like your defense budget. Okay, and these are the expenditures of some of the greater powers between 1933 and 1938 as far as their defense budgets. And I want to mention the United States, following World War I, signed a series of treaties that basically caused the United States to really demobilize its military. We cut production of aircraft and naval vessels, basically reduced the size of the Army and the Marine Corps down to almost nothing. And certainly we thought that we were never going to go to war again. And hence, when Germany and Italy and Japan decide that that's kind of the course that they're going to take and start expanding their military, we're going to have to play some catch up. These numbers that you see here are within millions of dollars. And so like when we look at, like, for example, 1935, the Soviet Union, we're talking about $1.6 billion in American terms, or for the Germans, or roughly a little over $2 billion as far as the amount of money they're spending. If you compare what, let's say, Germany's doing to the United States, U.S. is up here, we're playing a lot of catch up. And by the time we're kind of pushed into the war, our military spending is definitely lagging behind some of the Axis powers. And hence, we're going to have to do some changing here in the United States. It also helps, Germany and Italy and even Japan rebuild their economy right after World War One, because people who were unemployed were now getting jobs building things for the military, and that put a lot of people back to work. Yet at the same time, you're building stuff for the military, and that probably means at some point in time you're going to want to use that, and you're going to want to fight a war. And so, in a way, the telltale signs were kind of already being written. So, in number 9, when Hitler took control of Germany, he began rebuilding the German military and economy. This was achieved through government spending on public works programs that helped reduce unemployment, but much of the spending was spent on the rearmament of the military. When you look at it in terms of unemployment, just so you know, 1930s was kind of the time of the Great Depression here in the United States. Unemployment numbers are high. But once Hitler comes to power, you start seeing these numbers drop. And part of that was because the German people were building up for a stronger military. Basically, everything that they had kind of agreed not to do in the Treaty of Versailles, like pay reparations and get rid of their military, they kind of like throw that out the window, and they start doing everything that they weren't supposed to do. They stopped paying their reparations. They started rebuilding their military, and certainly that sends the signal that bad things are going to happen. Along with that, we need to also talk about the other things that were happening in Germany, and that was the treatment of the Jewish population. Just so you know, we mentioned a little bit ago that, Jews had been kind of the scapegoats for the Nazi Party, all the blames that they had for the economics and political instability, they kind of really put on the shoulders of the Jewish population. And so this hostility and prejudice towards Jews is called anti-Semitism. In 1935, and this is kind of a little backwards because the next thing I'm going to tell you actually kind of happens a little bit before this, but 1935, Germany passed a series of laws, and it wasn't just one, but it was several, called the Nuremberg Laws. And what the Nuremberg Laws basically did is they created a new legal status for German Jews. Basically, it said that they were no longer citizens and they couldn't own private property or hold civil jobs, meaning like jobs in government or jobs that are like public education or things like that. It took their voting rights away and it limited to where they could work. But one of the things that it required Jews to do is to wear the Star of David. If they were going to be out in public and they were over the age of roughly 5, that had to be sewn on to their outer garments. So that would basically tell anyone that's around them that they were Jewish. Also, if you had a name, your first name sounded a little more German, uh, the German government wanted Jews to have more Jewish sounding names so that, again, they would stand out from the population so that they could probably be picked on a little bit more. The whole thing that brought these Nuremberg laws to the forefront was an event called Kristallnacht. Okay, Kristallnacht happened basically in November, I should say shortly after November 1938. And what really happens is there was a Jewish Polish man who was living in Paris, and he went into the German embassy, shot and murdered a kind of a low-ranking German uh, government official. And Hitler used that as an opportunity to kind of, attack the Jewish population. And so he had his propaganda minister, Joseph Goebbels, organized this event known as Kristallnacht, the Night of Broken Glass. And it was staged to make it look like regular civilians went out and started like rioting and breaking, or vandalizing the property of Jewish people. The truth is, a lot of these were like Nazi thugs, and they went out and desecrated businesses. They destroyed synagogues. It was just a real complete mess. And this basically turns the tide into this, whole population going after the Jews and making it look like it's okay to do so. All right. Thank you very much.